there is a quiet war happening inside of you. You don't talk about it, not because you don't want to, but because you don't know how. It's not sadness. It's not anxiety. It's something harder to name. A tiredness that sleep doesn't fix. A tightening in your chest when someone speaks to you a certain way. A voice in your mind whispering, "This isn't right," but you smile. Anyway, you nod. You agree. You swallow. And over time, you begin to forget what it felt like to not be bent. Carl Jung once said that the greatest damage is not done in moments of loud trauma, but in the quiet places where we forget to defend ourselves. Not because we are weak, but because we were taught that kindness means silence, that love means sacrifice, that peace means submission. And so we allow, again and again, until we don't recognize ourselves in the mirror, until we confuse endurance with strength, until the poison becomes the norm. This video is not entertainment. It is not comfort. It is confrontation. You are not here because you're curious. You are here because something in you is tired of pretending, because some part of your psyche is no longer willing to be erased in the name of connection. Jung didn't write to make people feel better. He wrote to make people wake up. And what he warned us about was not the dramatic acts of cruelty that shock the senses, but the small, subtle patterns that rot the soul. This is a guide to those patterns. 7 behaviors, 7 distortions, 7 termites that don't shout but slowly hollow you out from within. They don't wear masks of monsters. They come dressed as love, humor, reason, even care. But beneath their surface is a steady dismantling of your self-worth, your voice, your center. This is not a list. It's a reckoning. And when it's over, you won't see certain people the same way. More importantly, you won't see yourself the same way. Because what you're about to realize is this: much of what you've called being good was actually self-abandonment. Much of what you've accepted in others was actually your unconscious refusal to confront what needed to be faced. And yes, it will hurt. Truth always does. But it will also liberate. Because deep psychology is not about fixing you. It's about uncovering what you buried to survive. And once seen, it cannot be unseen. So I'll ask you now, not gently, but honestly. Are you ready to stop pretending? Are you ready to face the 7 poisons you've been breathing in like air? Because once you start seeing clearly, you won't go back. You can't. One emotional manipulation disguised as care. They say it gently, don't they? I'm just trying to help. I'm saying this for your own good. At first glance, it sounds like love. It looks like concern. It even feels like safety. But deep beneath the surface, it begins to twist. This is the first poison Jung warned about: emotional manipulation disguised as care. And the reason it's so dangerous is because it doesn't announce itself with violence. It arrives quietly, with soft eyes, with concern in its tone. But it's not concern, it's control. Real love doesn't need to dominate. Real friendship doesn't need to test your loyalty through guilt. But manipulation thrives on the slow erosion of your certainty. First, they ask. Then, they suggest. Then, they imply. And before you know it, your decisions are no longer yours. You start second-guessing your own boundaries. Maybe I am overreacting. Maybe they're right, and I'm just too sensitive. No, you're not too sensitive. You're intuitive. That discomfort inside you is not weakness. It's your psyche recognizing a pattern it was never meant to endure. Carl Jung understood this with terrifying clarity. He saw that when someone doesn't want to face their own shadow, their own pain, their own truth, they look for someone else to mold Because it's easier to reshape another than to reconstruct yourself. And that's what emotional manipulators do. They use concern as camouflage. They wield guilt like a scalpel. They make you feel seen, but only so they can edit the version of you that exists. It starts with a question, then a tone, then a pattern. Why do you always take it so personally? If you really cared, you'd listen to me. And over time, you begin to internalize their lens. You become a character in their story. Not because you're weak, but because humans are wired to bond, to trust, to believe in good intentions. But intentions aren't always pure. Sometimes, care is a currency of power. And here lies the horror. Most emotional manipulation doesn't come from enemies. It comes from those closest to you, from those whose affection you crave. That's why it hurts. That's why it stays. Because when betrayal wears the face of someone you love, the mind splits in confusion. Jung warned that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid confronting their own soul. And the easiest way to avoid the abyss inside is to project it onto someone else. So they shape you, gently, persistently, until one day you realize that every time you feel discomfort, you silence yourself instead of speaking. You obey instead of choosing. You accommodate instead of resisting. That is not love. That is not care. That is erasure. And here's the truth. No one told you just because someone claims to love you does not mean they have the right to redesign you. Love that costs your voice, your truth, your selfhood is not love. It is consumption. So ask yourself this before we move on. Where in your life have you mistaken control for care? And more painfully, where have you used concern to manipulate someone else? Humiliation disguised as humor. They say it with a smile. They say it in front of others. They say it in a way that gives them cover. And when you flinch, when your face tightens for just a second, they laugh louder. It's just a joke, they say. Don't be so sensitive. But you know it isn't. Your body knows. Your spirit knows. Because this isn't laughter, it's humiliation wrapped in charm. This is the second behavior Jung warned about. A subtle, almost invisible form of symbolic violence that hides behind the mask of humor. At first, it sounds like teasing, something harmless, something playful. But there's a blade in it, quiet intent to lower you, to make you the punchline, to train you into passivity through social pressure. And the worst part, everyone laughs. Everyone joins in. And you, out of fear of being that person, the bitter one, the one who can't take a joke, you force yourself to laugh too. You betray yourself with a smile. This is how humiliation survives. Through culture, through group dynamics, through the myth that sarcasm and cruelty are cleverness. But Jung knew better. He warned that the unconscious mind cannot tell the difference between real violence and symbolic violence, between play and truth. Repetition embeds belief. And if the joke is always about your flaws, your insecurities, your boundaries, your worth, then eventually, even, your inner voice begins to echo the laughter. Maybe I am ridiculous. Maybe it, too much. Maybe I do deserve this. And once again, you shrink. Not because you agree, but because you've been conditioned to survive humiliation by embracing it. This is not lightheartedness. It's a performance of control, and it's most often acted out by people who are terrified of their own smallness. They project their inner inferiority outward by making others feel small. And you become the sponge for their shadows. But you didn't come into this world to be a canvas for other people's unresolved pain. You were not born to be the punchline in someone else's avoidance strategy. Laughter is sacred. It heals. It bonds. But not all laughter is born from joy. Some Laughter is born from fear, from the deep disowned parts of the psyche that cannot tolerate another person's light without trying to dim it. And it doesn't end at jokes. It becomes a culture, a code, a silent rule. If you protest, you're weak. If you smile through the pain, you're accepted. But Jung taught us that the price of this false belonging is the fragmentation of the self. You laugh, and yet you ache. You stay, and yet you vanish. So I'll ask you now, quietly, honestly, who in your life has made you laugh at your own pain just to stay close to them? 3. Gaslighting and mental fog. It begins with a look, then a sentence. That never happened. You're imagining things. You always make it bigger than it is. You pause. You remember the words. You feel them in your body. But now, you start to question yourself. Maybe you were remembering it wrong. Maybe you did overreact. And just like that, a crack forms in your reality. This is gaslighting, the third silent poison Jung warned about. Not an argument, not a disagreement, but a psychological war waged through denial, distortion, and dismissal. It doesn't scream. It doesn't hit. It confuses. And that confusion is the weapon. Jung called it a betrayal of the inner voice. The moment when you no longer trust your own perception, when someone else's version of events becomes stronger than your memory, your feelings, your truth. And once that breach is made, they no longer need to control you directly. You will do it yourself. You will censor your own reactions. You will soften your voice. You will swallow your instincts. Because doubt, once installed, grows like a fog. It covers everything. Gaslighting is the erosion of clarity. Not all at once, but gradually, silently, like water wearing down a stone. And the real cruelty is not in the words spoken, but in what happens inside you afterward. The confusion becomes chronic. You lose your internal compass. You begin to need them to tell you what is real. Jung wrote that when the psyche becomes untethered from its core, it splits. And that split is what gaslighting exploits. A person without trust in their own mind is a person easily controlled, a person easily manipulated, a person who becomes emotionally homeless in their own inner world. You begin to avoid confrontation. Not because you fear conflict, but because you fear not knowing whether your pain is real. And this, above all, is the deepest cut. Not that someone else lied to you, but that you began to lie to yourself to keep the relationship intact. Because sometimes the price of leaving is clarity, and clarity is terrifying. When you've been living in fog, so you adapt, you question less, you apologize more, you become small and call it peace. But it's not peace, it's exile. Jung understood that truth has a gravity. When we deny it long enough, it doesn't vanish, it implodes. And what was once a subtle discomfort becomes anxiety, despair, disconnection. If you've ever found yourself explaining your pain over and over, only to be told it's in your head, know this: it is not in your head. It is in your nervous system, in your memory, in your breath. It is real. And someone's refusal to see it does not make it disappear. It only makes it dangerous. So ask yourself, where in your life has the fog settled so deep that you stop trusting the one person you'll never escape, yourself? 4. Systematic emotional invalidation. You finally speak. Not with accusation, not with rage, just quiet honesty. You say how something made you feel. You share a discomfort, a sadness, a need. And what do you hear in return? You're overreacting. It's not that big of a deal. You're so dramatic. And just like that, your reality is dismissed. This is not misunderstanding. This is systematic emotional invalidation, the fourth poison Jung warned us about. Unlike gaslighting, which distorts your perception, invalidation does something even colder. It erases your right to feel. It tells you that your emotions are not just inconvenient, they are wrong, too loud, too complicated, too much. And so, you learn to shrink. You learn to hide the parts of you that feel deeply because every time you express them, you were met with indifference or mockery. And over time, your inner world becomes a secret, not sacred, hidden. Jung wrote that emotions are not obstacles to reason, they are messengers of the soul. When we repress them, we don't silence them. We exile them. And like all things exiled, they return in twisted forms: insomnia, anxiety, chronic tension, inexplicable sadness. Emotions don't vanish. They transmute. And when you are invalidated long enough, you begin to invalidate yourself. Maybe I am being needy. Maybe I should just stop talking. Maybe I'm the problem. This is how emotional erosion begins. Not in chaos, but in resignation. You become a quieter version of yourself, not peaceful, muted. You start to prioritize others' comfort over your own truth. You make yourself smaller, softer, invisible, not to survive danger, but to avoid disapproval. And the world rewards you for it. You're called easygoing, low maintenance, chill. But inside, you're folding in on yourself. Jung believed that when the self is denied expression, the psyche fractures, because we are not meant to live in numbness. We are not designed for emotional neutrality. We are meant to feel fully, to speak honestly, to inhabit our own depth without apology. But invalidation robs you of that. It trains you to see your emotions not as insights, but as burdens. And once that belief takes root, you stop reaching out. You stop asking for help. You stop naming what hurts. And eventually, you stop knowing what you feel at all. You just endure. So I ask you now, not as judgment, but as a mirror, where have you taught yourself to be silent just because someone else couldn't hold space for your pain? 5. Silent contempt and an emotional erasure. They don't raise their voice. They don't insult you. They don't say anything at all. And that is the cruelty. Silence. Cold. Precise. Calculated. You reach out, but they don't respond. You ask a question, nothing. You exist, and they erase you. This is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of contempt. And Jung saw it for what it truly is: psychic violence. When someone chooses to withhold their presence, their acknowledgement, their basic recognition of your being, not because they can't respond, but because they are choosing not to, they are using silence as a weapon. And it cuts deeper than words ever could. Emotional erasure doesn't break you in one blow. It dissolves you, minute by minute. Every unanswered message, every ignored glance, every deliberate absence. And you begin to question, am I invisible? Do I matter? Am I worth responding to? The human soul was not built to exist in a void. We are relational beings. We are wired to connect, to be mirrored, to be felt. But when someone intentionally removes that mirror, they steal more than attention, they steal your sense of existence. Jung warned that what we deny in ourselves becomes the shadow. And those who wield silent contempt often do so, because they are at war with their own shadow. They cannot bear their own vulnerability, so they punish yours. They see your need for connection as weakness, and instead of naming their fear, they weaponize your longing. But here's what no one tells you. When you stay in that silence long enough, you begin to internalize it. You mimic the erasure. You stop reaching out. You stop initiating. You stop feeling worthy of response. And so you slowly disappear, not because you were abandoned, but because you began to abandon yourself. The tragedy of contempt is not that someone rejects you. It's that you begin to believe you deserved it. That you were too needy, too emotional, too flawed. But you weren't. You were human. And what they withheld wasn't your fault. It was their inability to face you, to hold space, to treat connection with reverence. Jung spoke of individuation, the return to the self. And that journey begins the moment you stop equating someone's silence with your worth. Their distance is not your failure. Their dismissal is not your truth. Their coldness is not your reflection. So let me ask you this, before we move on. Where in your life have you mistaken silence for strength? And where have you allowed emotional erasure to define who you are? 6. The glorification of self-sacrifice. Since childhood, you've been taught a story. That love means giving everything. That being good means putting yourself last. That maturity means swallowing your needs so others can breathe easier. You were praised when you stayed quiet. You were applauded when you gave more than you had. And somewhere along the way, you began to believe it. You called it love. You called it loyalty. But Carl Jung called it what it truly is, the fragmentation of the self. Because not all sacrifice is virtue. Sometimes sacrifice is submission, a slow, quiet erasure of who you are. It doesn't happen in dramatic acts. It happens in everyday choices. Saying yes when you mean no. Staying when your soul is aching to leave. Nodding through conversations that exhaust you. Smiling when every fiber in your being wants to scream. And the world claps. They say you're generous. They say you're noble. They say you're strong. But they never ask what it's costing you. Jung believed that the self is sacred. That your individuality, your true center, is not something to be bartered away for affection. And yet, society tells you that being a good person means being endlessly available. That the more you disappear for others, the more you deserve love. But that is not love. That is spiritual exhaustion dressed as virtue. And here's the darkest part. The more you give, the more people expect. Because sacrifice, once normalized, becomes currency. And the moment you try to reclaim your time, your energy, your boundaries, they say you've changed. That you're selfish. That you're cold. But you're not. You're waking up. Jung warned that what you suppress does not vanish, it grows teeth. It returns as resentment, fatigue, even illness, because the body remembers what the mind tries to forget. The psyche rebels against abandonment, and when the rebellion is ignored, the soul begins to decay. So the question is not, are you giving enough? The real question is, are you still in there? Can you hear your own voice beneath the noise of obligation? Can you still feel your true wants beneath the guilt? You were not born to be a martyr. You were not created to vanish so others can feel full. Love, real love, does not demand that you disown yourself. It does not ask for the death of your joy, your energy, your boundaries. The glorification of self-sacrifice is not morality. It is emotional programming, a legacy of learned abandonment passed down through generations. And breaking it? That's not selfish. That's sacred. So I'll ask, what parts of you have been offered up on the altar of someone else's? Comfort? And more importantly, when will you finally stop calling that love? 7. Acceptance of contempt as the price for belonging. You didn't choose this. Not at first. No one wakes up and says, "Today I will tolerate contempt." But it doesn't happen all at once. It builds quietly. You tell yourself it's just a phase. You excuse the coldness. You explain away the sarcasm. You try to understand the absence. You make peace with rejection. And somewhere along the way, you begin to lower your standards so slowly, so subtly that you don't even notice. You start to believe that this is the cost of belonging. That to be close to someone, to be accepted, to be loved, you must endure. This is the final poison, the deadliest, because it doesn't just wound your emotions, it kills your identity. Carl Jung called it psychic death, a total disconnection from the self. The moment when your internal fire no longer burns, not because you found peace, but because you've surrendered, not to love, but to survival. When contempt becomes familiar, you stop noticing how unnatural it feels. You no longer flinch when they ignore you. You no longer cry when they mock you. You no longer speak when they silence you. And worse, you start to believe that maybe this is all you deserve. That you're difficult, that you're too much, that you're lucky anyone puts up with you at all. And here's the final trap. Once you internalize contempt, you seek it out. You recreate it. You mistake tension for passion. You mistake distance for maturity. You mistake crumbs for connection. You fear solitude more than self-betrayal. But Jung reminds us that the true journey of individuation begins with standing alone. That real belonging does not ask you to shrink. It asks you to stand in your fullness and be met, not tolerated. But most people won't make that journey because it's easier to bend than to risk breaking. Easier to stay in familiar pain than step into the unknown of it. Authenticity. And the system reinforces it. Society praises those who adapt, not those who resist. Who conform, not those who walk away. But adaptation is not always evolution. Sometimes it's erasure. And the cost? Your voice. Your vitality. Your soul. But if you've listened this far, if even one part of this message burns inside you, you already know this cannot go on. You are not here to beg for place in someone else's comfort zone. You are not here to be reduced so others can feel tall. And you are not broken for wanting more. You are only broken if you believe this is all there is. So I leave you with this question. When did you start mistaking survival for love? And more importantly, are you ready to choose something else? 8. Why most people stay trapped? You would think that once people see clearly, they change. That once the mask falls off, they leave. That once the truth burns through them, fog, they walk away. But most don't. Most stay. Even after the realization, even after the pain, even after their soul whispers, "This is killing you." They stay. Why? Carl Jung gave us a clue. The psyche prefers familiar hells over unfamiliar heavens. Because clarity is not comfort. Truth is not gentle. Awakening is not soft. And freedom, real, inner freedom, demands grief. The grief of letting go. Of people. Of identities. Of versions of ourselves that once made us feel safe. We stay in harmful patterns, not because we're weak, but because we're afraid. Afraid of the silence that follows walking away. Afraid of the loneliness that comes before true belonging, afraid of who we are, without the roles we've always played. Jung understood that transformation begins not with motivation, but with mourning. Mourning the self we had to become just to survive. Mourning the childhood lessons that taught us pain was love. Mourning the years we spent believing endurance was virtue. That grief is sacred. But instead of facing it, they return to the same relationships, the same dynamics, the same betrayals, because predictability feels like control, and control feels like safety. But it's not safety. It's paralysis. You may feel it now, that tightening your chest when you imagine letting go. That flutter of uncertainty in your gut when you picture saying no, stepping away, changing course. That's not weakness. That's the edge. The place where your old self begins to crumble and your real self begins to emerge. But here's the secret no one tells you. Transformation always costs something. And if it doesn't, it's not real. You will lose things. You will lose people. You will lose your own illusions. But what remains after will be solid, true, untouched by manipulation, unshaken by silence, unshamed by self-expression. That is the soul's reward. And still many will hear these words and walk back into the fog. Not because they didn't understand, but because comfort is addictive. But not you. You're still here, listening, feeling the burn of recognition in your chest. And that means something inside you has already shifted. So let me ask you one final question before we move on. What do you fear more, losing what isn't real, or never discovering what truly is? 9. The mirror without filters. You want clarity. You want change. But what if I told you that the real battle isn't with them, it's with you? Because there's something Jung understood that few dare to say out loud. Most suffering is self-perpetuated. Not because we want pain, but because we choose not to confront what we've allowed. This is not judgment. This is the mirror. The one without filters. The one you've been avoiding. You've tolerated the intolerable, justified the unjustifiable, called submission peace, called erasure love. Not because you're blind, but because you're scared. And that fear of confrontation, of loss, of standing alone has become the architect of your reality. Jung knew this terrain well. He warned that what you refuse to confront within yourself becomes fate. It shapes your choices, your relationships, your entire emotional life. And so you repeat. You explain away bad behavior. You convince yourself that you're being compassionate when, really, you're just afraid of being alone. But now, there's no more pretending. You've seen it, felt it, named it. And that means you can no longer lie to yourself without consequence. The psyche, once awakened, does not go back to sleep. So now, the real work begins. Not the work of blaming, not the work of exposing others. The work of reclaiming yourself, of asking the hardest questions. Who have I been enabling through my silence? What parts of me have I abandoned for approval? Where have I confused loyalty with self-erasure? This is the edge of transformation. Jung called it the confrontation with the shadow, not the monster in others, but the truth in you. The part of you that participated, that stayed, that tolerated, that kept smiling while you were dying inside. This is not about guilt. It's about responsibility. You cannot control what others do, but you are responsible for what you allow, what you repeat, what you normalize. And here's the paradox. True healing doesn't come from fixing others. It comes from facing yourself fully, brutally, tenderly, because that's where the wound lives, not in them, but in you. And only there. Can it be transformed? So I ask you, with no softening of the truth, when you look in the mirror, what do you see? Is it the person you were told to become, or is it the one you were born to be? And more importantly, are you willing to stop running and finally face who you truly are? 10. The liberation and the cost of waking. This is the moment where most people hesitate. Not because they didn't understand, not because they didn't feel the truth, but because they finally see the cost of waking up. Carl Jung never promised that individuation, the becoming of the self, would be easy. In fact, he warned us it would demand everything. And here you are, at the threshold, one foot still in. The old world, familiar, predictable, emotionally suffocating. 1 foot, trembling towards something unknown: freedom, truth, solitude, clarity. You've carried so much. Not just pain, but silence. Not just wounds, but the performance of being okay. And now you know you can't carry both your soul and your mask anymore. One of them has to go. This is the reckoning. The turning point. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just a quiet, irreversible decision inside you. I will not longer betray myself to be loved. That's it. That's the real liberation. Because the moment you stop negotiating your peace for scraps of affection, everything begins to shift. Some people will leave. Some routines will collapse. Some identities will dissolve. But none of it will be a loss. It will be a purge. What remains after the fire is what was always real. Your voice, your center, your sacred anger, your untamed tenderness. Jung understood that. The true self is indestructible, but only if you protect it from the slow death of compromise. You were never meant to live in a cage of politeness. You were never meant to smile through your own erasure. You were meant to rise, to walk out of the fog with your spine straight and your heart unashamed. But this is not a finish line. It's a beginning. You will stumble. You will grieve. You will sometimes miss the comfort of your chains, but that's okay. Because now you know what they are. Now you've seen what you were never supposed to tolerate. And once seen, it cannot be unseen. This video wasn't about others. It was about you, your patterns, your power, your possibility, and if even one part of you is burning with the desire to reclaim your life, honor it. Don't wait for permission. Don't wait for the pain to get worse. Begin now. Start small. Say no. Walk away. Speak honestly. Set one boundary. Break one cycle. And when the fear rises, as it will, remember this: the cost of truth is temporary, but the cost of self-betrayal is eternal. You've heard every word, felt every silence, touched every shadow. Now I ask you, not as a narrator, but as a mirror, what will you do with this awakening? Because once you've opened your eyes, you can never go back to sleep.